Okay, so our next lecture is going to be on bias, and we'll talk about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Even though we have already done this to a certain degree, this one specifically focuses on those concepts and phenomena. So, how does bias develop? Okay, so we talked about Tajfel's minimum group paradigm in that. Okay, people were assigned to groups. They were arbitrary, meaningless. There was no loyalty to the groups. They had no history together, but there was still in-group favoritism, is what was found. And it didn't require hatred. It was just enough to have this conceptualization of us versus them to have this basically in-group favoritism. So today's question is what happens once those categories do acquire beliefs, expectations, emotions, and social meanings? Then what happens? Okay, so we're going from just arbitrary and random to now the group has these things. Then group membership can start to influence how we perceive the world, even how our memory is altered and filtered, how we interpret behavior, and how we behave. And again, we're not looking at why are some people prejudiced. If we're being honest, we all have prejudices. And that's also just too simplistic. But what processes can contribute to prejudice? And some are going to be cognitive, there's motivational ones, obviously social, which we're interested in, cultural, ideological. And a lot of them, we've already studied some of these because prejudice doesn't require an entirely different kind of psychology. It does emerge from ordinary processes. We talk like categorization, schemas, conformity, attribution, identity, motivated reasoning. So, how does ordinary social thinking become prejudice and discrimination? Now, social categorization is going to be the first step. And is this necessarily bad? No, because it's a necessary cognitive function. We automatically do it. Because just think about this. If every object or person that we encountered was completely unique and novel, we would have to analyze it from the bottom up to determine what it is, and we would not be able to move through space and time. So, categories, they help us organize information, then we can make predictions, reduce cognitive load. Okay, so it's the same principle as schemas, basically. For example, we see somebody wearing scrubs. We automatically think they're in the medical profession. That category immediately activates possible information, and it's usually efficient. But here's the thing, once that category exists, we might start to exaggerate similarities within groups. In that, okay, again, if I have a specific feeling towards people in the medical community, when I see somebody dressed in scrubs, then I might attribute that feeling toward that person, even though I might not know them. We might also exaggerate differences between groups and start to attach beliefs to categories. And again, we just got done talking about like they are one of them. And so now we're interested in like, okay, what are they like? And this gets into stereotypes. And we'll talk about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Okay. Now, I just have to say, one of these does not result in the next, but they are correlated, and this is how this process can proceed. But I just have to say, just because you believe something, it doesn't mean you feel something, it doesn't mean that you're going to do something. All right, just to put that out there. But stereotypes, they are cognitions, they are beliefs. Okay? Example, people from older generations are bad with technology. That is a stereotype. And again, that could be construed as negative, or maybe it's just neutral. And again, it doesn't have to require hatred. But the thing is we could move to a prejudice, and now we're moving in toward having an attitude or feeling. towards somebody because they belong to this group and because I hold the stereotype that older people aren't as good at technology. Now, I don't like older workers based upon that stereotype. Okay? So now I feel a specific way toward that group because of the stereotype. Then we can move to discrimination if that prejudice is strong enough. Now we're behaving. Now there's an action. Now we're treating people differently because of group membership. So not only do I think that older people are not good at technology, so I don't like older workers, now I'm not hiring older workers. And again, this doesn't always work just like a straight process. You might know a stereotype, but you reject it. You might have a prejudiced attitude, but you don't discriminate against that specific group because rules and norms prevent it, thank goodness. And again, discrimination can occur without strong personal prejudice. So, an example might be like, okay, your boss or manager follows policy or procedures that systematically disadvantage a specific group, and they don't necessarily dislike anybody, but their behaviors result in unequal treatment. Okay. Also, can somebody know a stereotype without believing it? Yeah. Okay. So you know a lot of cultural stereotypes and you don't necessarily believe it. I'll just throw a couple out here. Okay. Blondes are dumb. Asians are good at math. Lawyers are untrustworthy. Now, just because you, again, know those stereotypes, it doesn't mean that you believe them. And that's going to be important when we get to implicit associations. So, a category gives us information about a group. It does not tell us who the individual in front of us is, though. But here's the thing. If stereotypes can lead us, again, they can lead us astray toward prejudice and discrimination. Why does our brain use them? Our brain uses them because it's part of system one thinking and they are cognitive shortcuts. Now, this goes back to when we talked way at the beginning of class about we are cognitive misers. We have limited processing capacity. Shortcuts are going to reduce our mental workload. Okay, so we can go back to schemas and heuristics. And that schemas, once we associate certain characteristics or things to a specific person or group, our brain will automatically use that information and attach it to that person or group automatically, and we do not have to put that information together. Same general principle. Our brains don't process every piece of information from scratch. We make assumptions based upon our previous experiences and our knowledge about the world. Okay, we meet somebody and learn, okay, this person is a surgeon. Very cool, okay? And so automatically that activates, okay, that surgeon schema. And you make, again, your brain possibly makes associations, okay? They went to medical school, they're involved in medicine, they probably work at a hospital, they have a very demanding job, okay? Those are going to be pretty automatic. Now, you didn't independently put all that information together. It just automatically came to you. And that's based upon what you know about being a surgeon. And this can be useful because these categories efficiently organize large amounts of information to help us move through the world socially. Now, the problem is once this framework is activated, um, we might start to notice stereotype consistent information. We might remember it better. When ambiguity comes into play, which we'll talk about, um, we might start to interpret ambiguity through these categories and overlook individual information and generalize characteristics to the group instead of the individual. So stereotypes they are efficient, but sometimes they can be inaccurate and unfair. So You could think about like a zip file for like on your computer, but it's for social information. It compresses a lot of information. It is useful, yes. But is it a perfect representation of every individual? No. So can we actually demonstrate stereotypes save cognitive resources? Okay. McCrae and colleagues actually tried to do this in 1994. So do they make processing more efficient? Okay, so participants had to do two things at once. They had to learn about a person named Julian and the traits about Julian were shown one at a time, and listen to information about geography. Okay. Half of the people were told that Julian is an artist. He was creative. Things to that effect. Other people, the other group, the control group, just received unrelated or neutral information about Julian. Okay. Again, meanwhile, there's all of this information about geography playing through the headphones. So the brain has two tasks here, and this matters because of cognitive load. So again, with condition one, Julian's an artist. So now they have a schema. There's a mental filing cabinet that has been open. And so we're opening up the artist, filing cabinet, and you can see like, okay, creative, okay, maybe paints, plays a piano, all of the information related to being an artist. And then condition two, there's no label. It's just Julian. So each characteristic has less organizing framework. Okay, so here's the thing. Which people in which group are going to remember more about Julian? Okay, another question. Who should remember more of the geography part? Okay, here's the why the geography part actually matters. Because if stereotypes really conserve cognitive resources and we can just automatically like pull information out without even trying. Participants using these stereotypes shouldn't only organize Julian better, they have extra mental resources for the geography task. Okay, so what actually happened here? The stereotype actually helped the processing. The people that were given the artist label actually remembered more stereotype consistent information about Julian, and they remembered more the unrelated geography information. The stereotype actually reduced cognitive effort, freeing up the individuals the ability to actually retain more information about the geography. So there was less effort needed to process Julian because we already had that schema about an artist. And so the brain automatically used that, freeing up space for the geography information. Okay. So here's also we can look at what improved, especially with the stereotype consistent information. So the schema isn't just a neutral filing cabinet. It's also going to influence our organization, attention, and memory. So we can look at like a self schema, like I'm bad at math. And again, that bad math becomes especially meaningful. Now, with the social schema, like artists are creative. And the information is consistent with the expectation. It fits neatly. It's easier to encode. And the thing is that can reinforce the stereotype. And so the expectation is, again, artists are creative. And again, we start to notice examples that fit. And so later, when we see this, we're like, oh, look, see, people in this group are really creative. And so it can feel like the stereotype came completely from experience when the existing stereotype influenced which experiences we actually paid attention to. So a shortcut can make thinking faster without necessarily making thinking better. Okay, and these are really powerful when the information is not completely clear. So ambiguity is going to play a role here. So this is Kunda and Sherman Williams, not the paint guys, which is kind of fascinating. Anyways, I don't think it's the paint people. Oh, let's see here. Somebody, let's imagine, just imagine for a second, then we'll get into this. Somebody bumps into another person. Possibility one, it's an accident. It's a crowded room. Somebody trips, they immediately apologize. There's not much interpretation needed, okay? It's fine. Possibility two, it's ambiguous. We bump the person, the facial expression is unclear, they don't say much, they just keep moving. Now, was that actually accidental? Careless? Was that aggression? Were they being rude? The ambiguity creates interpretive space. And again, we talked about how the brain likes to fill in gaps. And the brain uses things like schemas, expectations, and stereotypes to fill in these gaps. All right, so in regard to when stereotypes may matter more, it's actually during these ambiguous situations. Because clear behavior is evidence that tells us what happened, and our brain doesn't have to start to basically make assumptions. But with ambiguous behavior, the brain has to interpret it. And so the brain does have to draw on prior experiences. And so that's what researchers did. Again, participants read about a person whose behavior was clear or ambiguous, and they provided information about the person's social category, and then they asked when would the stereotype have the greatest influence, when behavior is obvious, or when it is ambiguous. Everything we just said. So again, so it's important because stereotypes don't necessarily make us make up or hallucinate behavior that never happened. It's much more subtle than that. Ambiguous information can receive different meanings. Now, the ambiguity amplifies bias. So when the behavior is clear, the social category had relatively little effect on judgments because, again, we could interpret the behavior and we did not have to go to that next level to interpret what was going on. But when the behavior was ambiguous, the stereotypes influenced how the behaviors were interpreted. The less the situation tells us, the more expectations can fill in the gaps. So, okay, we can talk about schemas here for a second. The schema offers the most likely interpretation. So if the expectation is people from this group are aggressive, okay? So the ambiguous behavior might be like, oh my God, they bumped into me because they were being aggressive. So that was aggressive. If the expectation is different, okay, it was probably an accident. And so this is why bias can feel actually like perceptibly reasonable. We're not thinking, I'm going to discriminate. We're thinking, I'm just interpreting what I saw. But truly, prior expectation influenced that interpretation. It's not completely independent like we think. And we can contribute attribution here too, and that the same behavior can receive different causal explanations depending on who did it, what we expect from somebody as well, specifically depending upon what group they belong to. Now, so bias, it has the most room to be effective when there's incomplete information, the criteria is subjective, the information's ambiguous. So think about how many consequential decisions happen under these conditions. Okay, you could think about judgments like, okay, is this applicant leadership material? Was that employee being assertive or difficult? Was that student's behavior disrespectful? Did that person seem threatening? Is this candidate a good fit? Now, none of these have really great objective measurements. And that's why ambiguity matters, because in regard to this, if we're talking about hiring, okay, we can talk about objective things like, okay, do they have a degree, experience, things like that. Less objective and more subjective is like, okay, what is their leadership potential? Are they a good fit? And the person that's hiring has to interpret that. Okay. In regard to, okay, we were just talking about like the classroom. Somebody doesn't make eye contact. It can mean maybe they're disrespectful, anxious. It's a cultural norm. They're distracted. And if I as an instructor already expect the student is a problem, that ambiguous behavior can confirm my expectation. Okay, Okay, so just so we're clear, not every subjective decision equals discrimination. And I really apologize. You might be able to hear that in the background, but Emmett, my dog, he is sleeping and he is having puppy dreams. And so he is yipping in his sleep because I think he's chasing a rabbit. Anyways, no, the point here is that ambiguity creates conditions where bias can influence judgment. So, in regard to this, we talked about expectations that we could potentially describe, but what happens if some associations become activated before we even deliberately decide what we believe? And this gets into explicit and implicit bias. I know we've talked about these to a certain degree, but we need to mention them again. So, explicit, what do you believe? You can consciously recognize this. You're aware of it. You can report it. You can intentionally endorse or reject it. Okay. I can tell you right now, I do have an explicit bias toward Brayburn apples and against every other type of apple, except Granny Smith once in a while. I can tell you that. I am very aware of it. I'm going to buy Brayburn apples. The rest of the apples, whatever, I'm going to look the other way, even if it's the only ones available. Don't care. Still not going to buy them. Not only is that bias, that's prejudice discrimination. Okay, I can consciously recognize that. Now, implicit is again right under the surface. It's more about learned associations. Okay. They're automatically activated. It's rapid. They're outside of our deliberate control. And so, just so we're clear, these implicit associations, it does not mean that we consciously endorse them, but they are still there. So, with these associations, again, culture repeatedly pairs groups with traits. The specific group, terrorists, or groups and evaluations. The group, dangerous. Now, the thing is, these associations can become accessible, especially when we're exposed to somebody from that group. And without us even knowing, our brain activates that. And without even knowing, this bias is activated, potentially activating the stereotype and prejudice, or something like fear. And we don't necessarily know where it's coming from, or avoidance. And again, with priming and automaticity, it's the same basic principle that we talked about, in that with repeated association over and over and over, it enhances the accessibility to that information, which enhances the automatic activation of it. Now, I'll give the example here just quickly in regard to I grew up, I was 14 when, no, 15, 14 when 9/11 happened. And so the majority of my teenage years were spent being inundated by media and a culture that associated Muslims with terrorism. Muslim equals terrorist, Muslim equals terrorist, Muslim equals terrorist. And again, I don't believe that. I don't think it's true. Anybody can be a terrorist. Doesn't matter what your religion is or background, anybody can be a terrorist. But what happened was there was this repeated association. And if you do that enough times, it becomes overly accessible. And I did catch myself one time in an airport giving a double take to somebody who did look as if they were Muslim. Again, I didn't know why, because I'm like, I'm not racist, I'm not anti-Muslim. It just happened. And I'm luckily I'm aware of that. And I'm aware of how these associations were made early on in my life and probably happened to lots and lots of people. And I'm aware of them and can combat them. But this is what happens when we're repeatedly exposed to this type of information over and over. It makes this information very accessible and it gets imprinted in us, creating these unconscious attitudes that can influence how we behave. And again, it doesn't mean that's what you secretly believe, or it doesn't mean how you'll behave. because we can reject it. I have rejected those things, and we can behave inconsistently with it. I don't avoid people who are Muslim or of any other religion for that matter. So, the association can exist in memory. The endorsement of it is a separate question. Okay, so where might these implicit plot processes matter more? Okay, they can matter more when decisions have to be rapid. Cognitive load is high, so we can't think through things very well. We're tired and we're stressed. The information's ambiguous again. We don't have time to go back and think, okay, I interpreted that incorrectly. So ambiguity and automaticity are very important here. So this is led to researchers trying to measure implicit bias. And we have the IAT, the implicit association test, which you can take on the Harvard website. Greenwald and colleagues put this together. So it does measure how quickly people pair concepts. So participants rapidly categorize social categories A and B with evaluation traits good and bad. The basic idea is the stronger mental associations should be easier and faster to pair. So, in regard to this, gonna just scroll down. Feel free to do this if you want to. The reaction time difference is interpreted as relative association strength. It's not interpreted as we look directly into your unconscious mind. So, um, in regard to this, is that we need to interpret it carefully because some people will take this and say like, oh my, and they automatically get defensive and say like, no, I'm not prejudiced. I don't discriminate. No, no, no. We're not saying that. Um, at the research level, these systematic patterns of association are just, they're culturally learned associations and they are worth studying. It can't tell us with certainty that you scored a certain score and so you're going to discriminate. Because behavior depends, okay, we've talked about this throughout the entire class, the situation, how motivated are we? What are the social norms? Can we activate that system two thinking to actually control our behavior? Do we have the opportunity to behave? So, again, it's not a prejudice test. It's an implicit association test. So, in regard to this, the implicit association test, it's not based upon explicit belief or behavior. Automatic does not mean uncontrollable. So with controlled processing, we can correct some of these things, override them, reconsider them, especially when we have motivation and we're given time. And we're aware of the bias. So if nothing else, what's great about the IAT is it can give us an idea of, oh, like, okay, hey, maybe I do have some implicit biases. Maybe I should stop and think about this. Or do I have implicit biases? That is a very important outcome that you can have from the IAT, if you would ever so choose to take it. Okay, we're just going to take a break here, then we'll come back with stereotype threat.